Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into preventing suicide because, like we said last week and the week before, suicide, it's one of those things that can't be talked about enough, and it's also Suicide Awareness Month. So we're going to be continuing with that theme. So I would say, and this is kind of my, surmise of when all things suicide, that validation is the biggest means of preventing suicide. I think if you can validate someone and say, I see your pain, I can see that you feel hopeless, I can see you feel lost, and I can see that you feel suicidal, that could be really helpful.
I agree with that. I mean, I think that's a pretty good way to look at it because, in past episodes, we talked about communication, and it's just a different way of using those kind of basic communication techniques because it's about listening and the validation and the empathy, right? Those three things we've gone over. And so the fourth step that I often included in that is solution. And you don't go to solution here. But I think when we get into talking about, how do you talk to someone who is expressing suicidal ideation, we'll get into a little bit more detail, but you're right. Because I think often they don't feel heard they're obviously hopeless. There's something going on in their life where they feel hopeless. I really believe that if someone can talk about it enough, then they themselves often come up with solutions. But that's not the goal. So I'm not saying, engage with someone so you can find a solution to their hopelessness. I think that comes eventually. But I agree with you. I think first and foremost, it's just about seeing their pain and seeing their hopelessness and being able to say to them, I get it. I get it. And to even say, this is the hard thing for a lot of people to do. I understand the reason you would want to take your own life.
Yeah.
And by saying that does not trigger them to say, okay, yeah, I'll kill myself. It just says, I get it.
Yes.
And I think often that's an important first step. So that's not everything, but it's a really important first step to let the person know you're there and you see their pain.
Exactly. And so many times people mistake, and we talk about it all the time, that people mistake validation for agreement.
Yeah.
And that's very much not the case. You can validate someone's emotions, but it doesn't mean you agree with them. So, I mean, just because you say, I can see that you're in pain, I can see that you want to kill yourself right now, I see that, that doesn't mean you're agreeing with their decision, obviously, right? But it's important for them to feel seen and to feel heard and to know that someone else cares, I think could be incredibly helpful, or someone else is trying to get into their emotional space, that someone else is trying to grasp the depth of their hopelessness. Because I would imagine that when you're feeling suicidal, you feel incredibly isolated and alone.
Yeah, I think often that's the case. Maybe not always, but often you do feel alone. It feels like you're the only one who has this deep of a sorrow or this depth of hopelessness. And so just to have someone sit with you and listen and talk about it and ask you about it, is really important.
And I think one of the things that people tend to think is that if I talk about suicide, it's going to put the idea in their head.
Yeah.
And that's not true. It's better just to bluntly say, if someone is talking about how hard their life is and you're even remotely concerned that they could be suicidal, just ask. Say, hey, are you having thoughts of suicide? Or I guess maybe a better way might be to go to someone else they trust and say, hey, I'm just concerned about this person, right? I mean, because I think you got to get the measure of the relationship. I mean, context of a relationship is important in this. It's better safe than sorry in those instances.
Right. And so, asking directly is important, but I don't know that I would start a conversation that way.
Right. Oh,
If you
yeah.
dig into it and, what are you worried about? What are you concerned about? And I think that often I see people in the office who do this and they say, I don't want to burden anyone. I don't want to make anyone else worry. And
Mhm.
so in that way, they hold it to, really tight. They don't necessarily want to talk about it. They just don't want to burden someone else. And so if you know someone who is struggling and you open the door, essentially talking about it is like, open the door and let's talk about it.
Yeah.
And that can be really relieving for the
Mhm.
person, because you're essentially saying this is not a burden. I think people should say that all the time. This is not a burden. This is why we're in a relationship. I want to help and I want to listen to you. So I think that's true. That's a common misconception about suicide is that don't talk about it because it'll give the person, an idea. I think another common misconception is I don't know that people who are talking about suicide really want to die.
Mhm.
I think they just don't want to live the life they're living.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of a distinction, but it's really different
Mhm.
because like if you die, that's such a final solution. If in the course of the conversation you get to let's figure out a way to live a different life
Yeah.
that because it's the life they're living or whatever's going on in their life, the context in that moment, that's what they don't want. That's what they feel hopeless about. And that's why I think it's important for friends and relatives to remember that because they think, oh, you just want to die, you want to leave me. I don't think that's it.
It's
They
not a
don't want the life they have.
Yeah. Well, and you have to remember if someone in your life is suicidal, it's not about you. And
Right. It's not.
you really have to make that important distinction. It's really about them. And some people can say that suicide is maybe selfish, and I can see why someone might perceive it that way, but again, still making it about you. And
Right.
I don't think it has anything to do with them trying to be selfish. I think it
No.
has to do with they don't see another way out. The closest I can think of to it is, like when you've been sick for a long time and you just feel like this is my life now because I just feel terrible. And when you have a cold, it seems to just drag on forever and ever and ever, and time seems
Right.
to go really slow.
Mhm.
Well, I mean, multiply that.
Right. Right. You feel like you can't get out of it. You don't have options. And
Yeah.
so I think the other thing that maybe we mentioned last week, men especially tend to be impulsive.
Hmm.
And often, having those suicidal thoughts is really a passing state for the person, meaning that if you can get them to slow up and if you, for instance, talk about it, or, in extreme cases, get them into a facility where they will be safe, then those thoughts pass
Yes.
because it can be very momentary for
Hmm.
them. In some cases, that's not all cases, because for some, people, it's pretty profound and long lasting. But I think that often if you get them to slow up the process, which could be by talking or keeping them safe in some way, then that desire to end their life passes. So
Yes.
it's
So
something to remember.
yes. And so, Mark, when you say men tend to be more impulsive, and we also know that in the United States, men tend to use firearms as a
Firearms more
means,
often.
yes, as a means of suicide, which is a reason why men complete suicide more often than women, as we
Right.
discussed last week. And
Right.
so I think it's very important to emphasize the importance of just putting a lock on your firearm. That is goes such a long way in preventing suicide by firearm. And the reason is because often just the act of having to unlock it gets them to stop and think. Like it slows them up just enough that
Right.
often that prevents it itself.
I'd suggest one step further. Get them out of the house temporarily.
That
It's
too.
not like you have
Yeah.
to get rid of them. I'm not suggesting that, but get them out of the house. Put them with a trusted friend so
Mhm.
that there's no way the person can access them.
Yeah.
If you're really worried about it and it's a temporary thing, and you let them know it's a temporary thing. And I think you can even say, I'm doing this because I care about you, and this isn't going to, to use this firearm is not an option for you right now. So it does slow it up. So I agree. If you have firearms in the house, they should be locked anyway.
Yes.
But if you have someone who is suicidal and you have firearms, I'd suggest get them out
Yeah.
temporarily.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing that I believe veterans often discuss is that's part of suicide prevention among veterans is because veterans, and I believe we did an episode on this last year, suicidality among veterans and police officers because, they deal with traumas that civilians and most people really can't understand
Hmm.
because the act of taking someone else's life, even in the defense of someone else, is got to be an incredibly daunting and hard thing. And I don't
Hmm.
know that we could ever understand and cope with that unless we've ever been through it. But almost all veterans and police officers, they go through firearm trainings, and so usually they have firearms in their home, and so it's probably a very common means for veteran police officers and military veterans to kill themselves is through firearms. And so that's one of the big things that I know military talk about, and I believe the VA talks about, is just giving them access or a means to lock up their firearms, just because that extra step often slows them down enough just to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, just to think about the act, and that goes a long way often in preventing the attempted suicide.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the warning signs of suicide. So things to look for. Now, usually suicide is going to most often start with depression,
Hmm.
and that depression is maybe going to start to become severe. Now, someone can certainly be very severely depressed and not be suicidal. That's an
Yes.
important distinction to
Yeah.
make.
Right.
But when they do get into that realm of severe depression, or maybe even profoundly depressed, or what we talked before about complicated or profound grief,
Hmm.
what are some things to start looking for when you know someone is in that? What do you look for as terms of them becoming suicidal?
With specific to profound grief or just with depression in general?
I mean, I would like to discuss both, but let's
Okay.
start with just depression. Like, what are the signs that you look for when someone who is just really depressed?
So it's important I'll just reiterate what you said, meaning these signs, if someone has these signs, does not necessarily mean they're suicidal.
Hmm.
And, it could just be a function of their depression, but you should, listen to them and pay attention to the signs. And then I think the only way to make sure is you start a conversation with them, as we've
Yeah.
talked about. You start talking about it. So if you listen and hear statements, I'm going to kill myself, or I wish I were dead, or I wish I hadn't been born, those are certainly statements that I would be concerned about, and the part of a severe depression, I think. If suddenly someone goes and buys a gun, or maybe they're stockpiling pills,
Hmm.
they aren't telling you, but somehow you see, oh, they're stockpiling these pills, then that's another sign, because it could be that they're acquiring the means to
Hmm.
hurt themselves. I think part of depression, most depressions, is withdrawal from life. You don't find joy in doing the things that you used to do. And so what that means is you withdraw from that social contact. And I think that's a really important indicator that you pay attention to and you address it. Uh,
Hmm.
Especially if, so we aren't talking about introverts who, like to withdraw anyway, but if
Yeah.
it's an unusual pattern
Right.
of behavior,
Hmm.
that's what you want to really key into. Is this different than this person normally is? I think mood swings can often be a part of it, manic or depressed, being preoccupied with death, dying
Okay.
or violence. Here's one that's pretty direct about hopeless, feeling trapped. Although, I certainly hear people talk about feeling trapped and they aren't suicidal. So, but I think that's a big indicator. If their drug use or alcohol use changes and increases,
Mm.
pay
Hmm.
attention to that. Different eating routines, different sleeping routines. This is more of an obvious one. If someone starts giving away belongings or getting their affairs in order when there's no other logical explanation for that, saying goodbye to people as if they'll never see them again. And so agitation. So that would be more of a personality. Yeah, it's part of a personality change. If they become
Hmm.
really agitated, I think pay attention to that. Could be depression, could be anxiety. But again, if you see these signs, then I think the next step is you have a conversation about it.
Yeah.
Hey, I noticed you were, these pills, or I noticed you've been in your bedroom a lot and you haven't, been out with us with the family. Just like to know what's going on. How are you feeling? Things like that. So address it. Don't let it go.
Exactly. And you don't necessarily need to be blunt and just go on with, "Hey, are you thinking of committing suicide?" Right? I think you can
Well, I
lead
think,
into
yeah,
it.
I think if you start the conversation that way, that's a little too stark. But I
Yeah.
think if you start to have a conversation and you're paying attention to what the person is saying, I think you'll pick up if they're thinking about that. And then I would address it.
Yeah.
I'd say, it sounds like you're contemplating harming yourself. And tell me about that. And they
Yeah.
may say no or yes or whatever it is. And then I think, if they say, yeah, I've thought about it, then the next step is to say, have you thought about a plan? Do you have a
Mhm.
way that you would do it? See, and
Mhm.
again, don't be afraid to ask that because that's
Oh,
not to
yeah.
say, go ahead and kill yourself. It's just if you know the plan, and often they will tell you. I think, if someone is suicidal and you have a close relationship, they'll let you know and they'll
Mhm.
tell you what the plan is. And then you solve that. You keep them safe. Yeah, I've thought about the gun. Well, you lock up all the guns, right? I'm got all these pills, and you say, well, let me keep the pills for you. And so
Mhm.
you slow up the means so that it's not an impulsive act. I think
Right.
those are some of the warning signs that you need to have.
Right. And so I think the way you handle it is important, like when someone comes to you, because it's going to be incredibly vulnerable. I think some important things to avoid is, for one, approaching it with anger or saying, well, why, how could you do that to me? Or why
Right,
would you think
right,
of
right,
doing that? Those are unhelpful. Or just saying, no, 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 don't think of that. Don't do that.
right,
You
right.
have so many reasons to live. Well, I mean, they're coming from a good place, but they're not helpful in that moment. It's more helpful to say, I can see you're in a lot of pain and, I'm concerned for you and I really care about you. I would like to help you.
Yeah, those things you just mentioned are the opposite of validation.
Yes.
Right. No, 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 don't do that. Or no, that you don't want to do that. That's the opposite of validation. And
Yep.
it's going to be people are going to find themselves going so easily to that because they don't want the person to harm themselves. And
Yep.
so you really have to stay with the validation and the empathy. That's what's needed in that moment so that you can truly say, I get it.
Yeah.
I understand the reason you're feeling hopeless.
And don't be afraid to acknowledge to yourself that you're scared. I mean, because suicide, it's uncomfortable. I mean, it makes us uncomfortable. The idea that someone we love and care about wants to kill themselves
Mhm.
is, I mean, it's very disconcerting and it's very uncomfortable for us. And so be prepared for that, but try not to let it show, right?
See, I think it's important to be authentic.
Yeah. Yes.
And this is a bit of an aside, but it's one of the things that really bothers me about the old school way of teaching therapists, which is therapists are always supposed to be a blank slate and not show the emotion. But
Mhm.
if someone's telling you this heartbreaking story
Oh, yeah.
and you don't react, I think that's really hard for the person.
Mhm.
If somehow you think, oh, I can't react, I can't show my emotions. If it's a heartbreaking story and it's so sad, being authentic and showing your sadness and
Mhm.
showing your fear, if that's what it is, showing your concern, that's what the person wants to see.
Yeah.
So this is tricky, Liz, because you
Mhm.
brought up some really good points. It's not about you,
Yep.
it's not about the person, it's about the person you're talking to. And so you can be authentic and show your emotions and not make it about you.
Yes.
Because you can say, yeah, I'm feeling scared or I'm feeling concerned, but I want to listen to you. So
Mhm.
you can say, yeah, this is my emotional experience right now, but you turn it back and say, I want to talk to you about this.
Yep.
I want
Yeah.
to I want to listen to you. So yeah, it can be tricky. I mean, I understand why people are a little apprehensive about doing it.
Mhm.
If you are not used to listening with the validation and empathy in mind, I think people can learn how to do it, but it can be tricky to do that
Yeah.
and make it about you.
Yeah, I get that. And also, I think remaining calm, I think it can be
Mhm.
very easy
Yeah.
when someone starts talking about suicide to just I mean, you become really agitated or you become scared, and if you let those kinds of emotions overpower you, it can make that situation worse and it can make this person maybe regret opening up to you. So you definitely want to avoid that. But
Yes. Yes. But see, you can state your emotions without
yes.
being agitated. So I agree with you. It's important to remain calm.
Yeah.
And so you can say, I'm feeling scared or I'm feeling anxious and not get agitated, not get wound up.
Yeah.
Because that when you do that, that makes it all about you. And so
Yes.
remember, this is not about you. It's about them.
Yes. Now, I think it could be helpful to say, I can see that you're hurting and I can see you're afraid. I want you to be around. I don't want you to die. I want to be with you. I want to be able to, enjoy the rest of our lives together,
Mhm.
in whatever context your friendship is. I think those kinds of things can be helpful. Just saying, I see value in who you are as a person and I see value in you being around. I think that can be part of it, but I mean, it can be a really delicate thing and it can be so hard when, you're faced with the situation. And so I think the most important things to remember are stay calm, validate them, and try to find out what their plan is and say, okay, well, let's do this. Let's come up with a plan to prevent this. What are some things that we can do? What can I do that could help alleviate, that can help bear your burden? What's
Yeah.
something I can do to help you to feel better? Even
Yeah.
if it's, and sometimes just sitting there quietly with someone,
Hmm.
just knowing
Yeah.
that they're not alone, that someone is just there, or can I play some music, right? Or, can we go out and go for a walk? Can we do something?
Right. Right. I agree with that. So that's the depression
Mhm.
piece. You mentioned profound grief. And I think that when you're talking about profound grief or prolonged grief, that the
Mhm.
issues are slightly different and probably not as many because it's the loss of someone who's so dear to you. And so I could see this in the case of, say, you've been married to someone, your wife or your spouse died, and you get to a place where you can't see life being good without.
Mhm.
And so it's that element of hopelessness that the loss of that person is so deep and profound for you that my life will never be the same. And my life will never be as happy,
Yeah.
or my life will never be as fulfilled. And so I
Mhm.
think those are some of the signs that lead to that profound grief. And so if you know someone, say, who is experiencing that prolonged grief, say they've lost a spouse or a child, I mean, I think we've
Yeah.
talked about in the past that I think that is the hardest thing to get over for any parent is the loss of a child. But, that type of grief can certainly be really profound and long lasting. And so if you're the person who sees that, in the person who's grieving that it's gone on very long, then you really need to address it. And I
Mhm.
think as we talk to that person, it's the same thing. You want to have the validation and the empathy. You don't want to go into it saying, "Oh, life will be okay, life will be better. You'll see." You really want to go in deep to their profound grief and their loss and how they believe that their life is not going to have meaning or that their life
Right.
is not going to be fulfilling. Because I think in talking about it, then the solutions emerge or the resolution emerges that
Mhm.
often it's just being able to talk about it and have someone really see how deep your grief is. So I
Yeah.
think those are the cases where the loss of a spouse, the loss of a child, perhaps the loss of a very dear friend. It could
Mhm.
also fall into that category. But I think that the warning signs are slightly different. It's certainly, I think profound grief has withdrawal, a
Yeah.
pretty strong withdrawal element. And if you're checking up on the person, you feel like the grief is going on too long, then don't let it go. Talk to them, address it, and
Mhm.
express your concern. But go into it with validation, no judgment, and
Mhm.
empathy.
Yeah. So I think another thing to consider is, when you lose a spouse or you lose a child, I think there's going to be a strong desire to want to be with them again,
Hmm.
particularly if there's religion involved,
Hmm.
and you believe in an afterlife. And, they may be thinking, killing myself is a way to get back to them. I can be with them again. And so I think that's another thing to look for is if they are suddenly talking about, if you're noticing these things and they're suddenly talking about being with their spouse again and how much they wish they could be together with this person that they lost again, or I wish I could be with this person that died, that can be a warning sign. And I want to note again that just because someone is expressing one of these things or one of these behaviors doesn't necessarily mean they're suicidal.
Right, right. Yeah, so they're different, but I think the solution and how you approach it is pretty similar. So the questions that you ask someone, so we're talking a lot about having the conversation and, doing it with really listening well, the validation and the empathy. I think it's really important. I like open-ended questions. as
Mhm.
opposed to closed-ended questions. For our listeners, just to clarify what I mean, an open-ended question is not yes, no. Like
Yeah.
here, do you ever feel like just giving up? That's a closed-ended question. It's yes or
Mhm.
no.
Mhm.
And what I don't like about closed-ended questions is often you just get the answer yes or no. Here's an open-ended question. How are you coping with what's been happening in your life? See, that's not yes or no. It invites a dialogue.
Yeah.
It invites them talking about it. And so if you're going to interact with someone who you're concerned about, I think it's okay to go into it and think about questions. Think about open-ended questions that you might want to ask. Be prepared, I guess is
Yeah.
what I'm saying.
Mhm.
And I think that's important for a lot of different issues that we face. I don't think there's anything wrong with thinking about how am I going to approach this? And if I want to ask open-ended question, what could some of those questions be? Because what you're doing is you're priming your frontal lobes at that point so that when you get into that conversation, it's like you already have some of those up there and
Mhm.
they'll come to you more easily.
And it'll feel more organic. And you
Yeah.
don't that can make it easier for a conversation to feel less contrived.
Hmm.
Right. And so, that can be helpful. And I mean, the biggest thing is someone who is feeling suicidal or who is going through suicidal ideation, they feel less alone, is really
Hmm.
what it comes down to. They feel that they have someone,
Yeah.
anyone that cares. And so I think that people who are grieving or people who are depressed, they may need time to be alone and they may need some space, and that's okay, but don't give them too much space. But I think you can find ways to just say, hey, I'm here. And if you haven't heard from them or see them in a while, just say, I haven't seen you and I'd really like to talk to you. And I think one thing that could also be really helpful is people love to be asked questions about things that they know about. So,
Hmm.
like for example, say someone is really into sports or something, right? Or they have an interest and maybe they aren't as interested in it. Say, hey, I have a question about this sport. Can I ask you that? Or can we get together so I can talk to you about this? People feel flattered by those kinds of things. And often, and people want to share their knowledge. And so that can be a really great way just to kind of open the door to saying, hey, I'm here and I want to check in on you without feeling like you're being overly intrusive in their life. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Yeah. I also think it's important if you can to get them out and moving. Let's go for a walk.
Yeah.
Let's get out into nature. I think walking in parks is great. Most cities have parks. Salt Lake City, it takes you 15 minutes to get to a canyon, like Mill Creek or any of these canyons. And so getting out in nature, often I'll read headlines and not the actual story, but I saw a headline recently that I really believe that an hour walking in nature, I think is just as good for you as meditation. It resets something within you.
Yeah.
There's actually something that happens with your eyes when you extend your focal length, which when you're out in nature. And
Okay.
so it can be really beneficial for you. But often the last thing anyone wants to do, when they're feeling down like that or depressed is to get out. But I think,
Mhm.
with a little pushing, you get them out and get them walking, get them moving. It's
Mhm.
symbolic of moving forward. I'm walking, I'm moving forward. I've got some forward momentum and I'm out in nature and it's healing.
Yeah, or can we sit outside
Yeah.
and talk? That could be a good first step,
Hmm.
right?
I think I like to always summarize and give a takeaway. I think the takeaway is if someone you know is indicating suicide or thinking of suicide, or you pick up some of those warning signs and they behave in such a way that makes you think the person may be suicidal, do not ignore it. Don't
Mhm.
ignore it. Don't play it down, but address the issue. Even if it seems like you're overreacting, in the end, that's better.
Yeah.
You're dealing with someone's life, someone who you love and you care about. It's okay to overreact. And maybe it does strain your relationship. That's okay. They'll get over it.
Yep.
They'll get over it. And so don't ignore it. That's the
Yeah.
takeaway. Address
Yeah.
it.
Emotions are valid.
Yeah.
All emotions are valid. Don't ignore your emotions. They're telling you something. If you're feeling this profound depression and if you're feeling like you want to die, like you want to kill yourself, don't just ignore that. That's your body and your mind's way of telling you something is wrong.
Something's
And
wrong in your life. Yeah, I agree.
yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, don't run from that emotion.
Mhm.
Face it.
Yeah,
Acknowledge it. Acknowledge that you are so miserable you want to die. Essentially, you're validating yourself. And I think it's just as
yeah,
important to validate your own emotion as it is to validate someone else's. And if any time there's any talk of suicide, I think you can always throw that number out there. It's
yeah.
988. Very easy to remember now. And you can just say, hey, this is this line if you need it. Because I mean, you never know. All right, this has been a good conversation. And again, 988, that suicide
Right,
prevention line, and the old suicide prevention hotline, that number is still active
right.
too. And I believe there's a number you can also text. Is that correct?
I think you can text the 988, I
Okay.
believe.
Okay.
That's what I read. I'm pretty sure I read that.
Okay,
Yeah,
which is good to know because for some people it's easier to,
text.
especially, yes, especially for younger people, especially teens,
Yeah,
it's easier for them to text. So next week we are going to talk about suicide among teens. And so Mark's daughter, Dr. Adrienne Burton Denmark, is going to be joining us. She works a lot with
teens. Yeah.
teenagers.
Often we end up having these niche practices, and that's turned out to be hers is adolescence. But also, she started her career at the University of Texas at Austin, and college students are just kind of slightly older adolescents. So,
Yep.
and then her dissertation was on suicide as well within that population. So she has a lot of experience, and I think it'll be a good podcast.
Yep. And as always, if anybody needs anything, please feel free to send an email out to us, and we will see you all next week.
Have a good week, everyone.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.